My dad is from Santa Clara Pueblo. And that began actually for me when I was growing up, a tricultural experience. We would go to the Pueblo for traditional activities and visit family. But my father did not grow up speaking our native language. The same thing would happen when I went to Brazil. And my mom would take my brother and I back every 2 years. So again, going to Brazil, I'm immersed in a situation where everyone else is speaking Portuguese. I can barely kind of get by. So both of those examples meant that what I had was a nonverbal and somatic experience with these cultures. So embodied code switching actually takes each of these identities within their culturally embodied ways and invites, a person to move in between them consciously and with awareness and noticing what happens as they go from one to the other. This book is really, my ancestors wanted me to do this. I'm going to start crying. Like, it was that strong of a message.
Hello, everybody. I have an awesome guest today. Today, I'm joined by Marcia Bonato Warren. She's a trauma-informed body therapist, somatic counselor, interculturalist, and now an author. Marcia has over 30 years of experience working with cross-cultural mental health, and she brings a really unique lens to the conversation around identity, trauma, and healing. So we're going to dive into lots of different stuff. I'm not sure exactly where the conversation will go. We'll probably talk about identity and where it lives in our body, maybe a little bit about the nervous system, healing, especially from a multicultural background. So Marcia, welcome to the show. I'm excited to dive in.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited too.
Yeah. How are you feeling today in general?
Let's see. As a somatic therapist, that's a really pertinent question. Let me just check in. I'm actually feeling really good. I'm in Boulder, Colorado. It's a beautiful day outside. The leaves are starting to come out. It's green, and I'm excited to do this.
You actually have some seasons there, right? You see changes in the color and stuff like that.
Yes. Although it seems to be moving more quickly through a few seasons more than others, but yeah, we still have them. Yeah. So it's beautiful.
So I have a funny question for you to start off with. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
That is a great question. I'm not sure if I consciously knew, but I had always written, I think, and read a lot as a kid. I loved to read. One of my first memories is being at my grandmother's house in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is my Native American grandmother. And just so folks know, since we're talking about identity, my mom is from Brazil. She immigrated to the States when she was probably in her late 20s, early 30s. And then she met my dad, who's Native American. They were both teaching at a university, and that's how they met. So I'm both Native American and Brazilian. So basically, I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, visit my grandparents in Albuquerque. And my grandmother was an avid reader. And one of the first books I remember reading was Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. And I remember just being struck by that and remembering that. And started writing a journal when I was probably 13. So I've always written. I think what I wanted to be, just really at the heart of it all, was a helper and a healer. Even though I didn't have words for it, I think that's where I found myself in my family system and with my friends. I was always the person that folks felt safe enough to talk to. So I held that very, with a lot of respect, I think.
Was that from a young age? Were you always the person that people talk to? And like, even when you were, younger, adolescent and stuff like that?
I feel like that, and, our memories obviously are so subjective. So, my sense of it is that I was always trying to bridge conversations and, help folks communicate and try to understand how things were going. I was pretty sensitive, so I could feel, a lot of emotions in the room and didn't really know how to hold all that for myself and for others, but I was very much tapped into that. So yes, I think I was. I always felt like I needed to, yeah. And also, I shared this with my brother. He and I laugh, we're both huge advocates in our own field, did a lot of advocacy work. So we seem to feel like we've come here to do something, like there's a sense of purpose of we're here to do something, so that's also part of it.
Shake things up a little bit.
Yeah. Maybe, leave the world a little bit better than when we came in.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in your name. So Marcia Bonato Warren, were you named after anybody, or do you know anything about where your name came from?
Okay, so names are so important, and I love that you asked this question. For all the listeners out there that have names that are constantly mispronounced, they're going to understand what I just am about to say. My mother, being from Brazil, named me Marcia because it's a common name in Brazil, and she thought in the United States people would be able to say it. I grew up during the time of the Brady Bunch, so of course, there's a Marcia on the Brady Bunch and spelled the same way as mine. So I was constantly being, mispronounced in terms of my name.
Marcia.
So growing up, is constantly Marcia, as you remember that phrase. I know. So, from like the time I can remember being in school, I was constantly advocating for myself through my name, even though I didn't know that's what I was doing. So Marcia is a name from Brazil. It's not a family name. I don't know anyone else in my family that has it. I love it, actually. I think it's a beautiful name. It feels strong to me. I think it comes from the root of Mars, Mars Latin. So there's a little bit of the warrior in there, which I like.
Yeah.
And then my name has actually changed a bit. So I was born Marcia Evelyn Warren. And then I am divorced. And so I had a married name that was also attached to the end of Warren. So I had a very long four-name name.
Not very good for forms that you need to fill out.
Oh, no, I didn't hyphenate. So that confused computer systems even more. So it was just pronouncing the whole thing was a chore. So when I got divorced, I decided I wanted to bring my mother's maiden name into my name, which is actually the way that you do it in Brazil. And so my mom hadn't done that. So Bonato is my mom's maiden name. So now I have Bonato as my middle name and Warren is my last name, and which really ties me to my lineages. So I'm really happy with this name.
Does Warren come from your father?
Yes,
Okay.
It does.
So you have everything represented there.
I do. Yeah.
Very cool.
And it's easier to pronounce a little bit,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also, it's interesting. So your background from Brazil, being from California, obviously we have a lot of, Latina people that, would pronounce Marcia.
Yeah.
But that's not how it's pronounced. Marcia.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, growing up in New Mexico, I think that's what my mom thought too, because we have a predominant Hispanic community. And but that it still didn't quite translate. And it is funny, there's a subtle difference between Marcia, which in Portuguese is more pronounced like Marcia, so it's a wider A sound. And then Marcia, which is a little bit more of a Spanish pronunciation, so it's on. And then in English, we just don't even know what to do with accented N equal.
Marcia, because it becomes Marcia again.
Exactly. Oh, and I've had all different iterations, which I will not put out there back in the world, because finally I have people saying Marcia the first time when they see my name, which is interesting.
That's great. Well, and you said it's a form of advocating for yourself. It always has been, right? There's power in your name.
Yeah. And it's the first thing that is, in a sense, given to us, right? As a marker of who we are in the world.
Yeah.
So if someone is constantly mispronouncing your name, in a lot of ways, that's a deeply, I think, somatic and psychological push against our existence, not to get too big about it. But, if you're constantly saying, no, this is how my name is said, and how it's pronounced, you're also asking folks to really see you and really validate you. And that goes not just for names, it goes for pronouns, it goes for any identifying parts of ourselves that feel very important and very much a living, breathing part of ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Before diving more into kind of what you do and what you focus on, what else do we need to know about you as a human, about your journey? What else do we need to know about you to understand kind of how you came into this focus?
There's so much, I think, about our lives that are our first level of education, let's put it that way, that a lot of folks don't really tap into for themselves. And I think for me, because I grew up in the way that I did, and I'll share that story, in some ways I had no choice but to be in the classroom of my life. A lot of what I was living actually informs what I do now. So as I said before, my mom is from Brazil. She came to the States really not to stay. She was going to teach for a couple years and go back to Brazil and hone her skills in English. And so she came as a professor of Portuguese and Spanish. She decided to stay one more year past the 2 years. That's when she went to another university where she met my dad. And that's, where she fell in love and they got married. And
he's doing everything.
And reverted the plan, so to speak. But it's a lovely story because they were apparently the last two single people on this campus, and so his graduate students set them up thinking that they would be the perfect match, and it worked. And so they moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. My dad is from Santa Clara Pueblo, which is north of Santa Fe, about 30 minutes. And that began actually for me when I was growing up, a tricultural experience. So I lived in Santa Fe. We would go to the Pueblo for traditional activities and visit family. But since my father did not grow up speaking our native language because of federal policies, obviously prohibiting these things and boarding school situations and all of that, I didn't understand a lot of the language that was being spoken, mostly by my older relatives, right? Same thing would happen when I went to Brazil, and my mom would take my brother and I back every 2 years for probably about 6 weeks to 2 months. So we would get immersed on kind of a regular basis with my Brazilian family. She also didn't speak to us in Portuguese at home. And I think, and she would probably agree that because she was still gaining English and she was fluent, but that was not where her mindset was. And she was still fully within an English mode there. And my dad didn't speak Portuguese. So again, going to Brazil, I'm immersed in a situation where everyone else is speaking Portuguese. I can barely kind of get by. So both of those examples meant that what I had was a nonverbal and somatic experience at these cultures, right? So then I feel like from a very young age, I got very attuned to noticing my environment and the people in it. So, what the cues were, how to respond, how is it different? How does it feel? What do I need to do? Do I need to laugh? Do I need not to? Like those things were deeply unconscious, but that's how I was adjusting to each of those immersions. And then I would come back to Santa Fe, continue in some way to have those immersions through my parents, because they are the first representatives of those cultures. But then I'd have this in-between identity that was, kind of in the midst of both of those immersions and still trying to be in the Santa Fe one, which is also a different culture, but overall the U.S. dominant culture too. So all of that, I think for me as a young person growing up, there was a sense of fragmentation and compartmentalization between those because they were so different in terms of geographic areas, but also within myself. So my sense of self was in some ways very boundaryless. I was very permeable and never really quite felt like I belonged.
So in each of those situations, you felt like you didn't quite belong in any of them necessarily, even the, kind of traditional American one.
Yeah, especially the traditional American one, because, you get an added layer of being from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And if anyone knows Santa Fe, it has its own history as well, So a massive cross-cultural, history where, we have a lot of different traditions. Spanish is spoken, we have, 19 pueblos in the state. It's, folks that came from the East Coast were seekers and artists. And, it's a very different environment. Yeah. And so for me to come into college, I went to school in Texas undergrad, was also a culture shock. So I was like, what? Yeah. So I think I always wanted to seek a way to understand different cultures. That's what I studied, did a lot of, international relations, international, based kind of programs. And so there's always sort of this desire for me to try to figure this out, first within the world, but then later within myself.
Back when you were young and, going between these different environments, did you notice judgment from the people within those?
Yes and no. Again, it's like, I bring this back to the body because that's really where I first started to unpack that for myself when I went back to school as a somatic therapist, which happened when my kids were young. That's my second career. It was really the first place as I was starting to explore identity and how I move in each of those identities that I realized how many beliefs and judgments I held about myself in those contexts, right? And a lot of that was the not enoughness, right? So I'm not enough. I don't understand. I always need to learn more. And the knowledge is out there somewhere. It's not within me, right? So that makes sense if you're very externally focused. But there were those instances where, if I wasn't understood, if I spoke English and someone didn't understand me, of course there'd be a reaction, and I would feel awkward. I would feel bad about that. And impatience, especially in Brazil with, cousins my age, and younger, none of us knew what we were doing. So it's like they didn't understand why we didn't speak Portuguese. And my brother and I would try, and they'd just be like, okay. And, that I think is sort of the catch of it all when we come across differences, is that we have both an external situation that may not feel so good in our systems, and then we try to make meaning of it and metabolize it in some way within ourselves that also may not feel so great, right? So it's kind of slowing down that process and understanding that, you're hitting an edge of difference that can also be a great opportunity for growth and understanding.
And when you dive into it, when you allow yourself to dive into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
On the flip side, can you recall any experiences where you were really struck by feeling apart, like as like you belonged in those situations where in your body it was like, wow, these are my people?
It is funny because since I am such a mix, of my parents, my skin tone is that of my father's side of the family, right? So, when I went back to the Pueblo, then there are other folks with my skin tone. So there's a skin familiarity with that. Okay. My grandmother and she and I have, she's passed, but she and I have similar hands. And so like, there's that sense of like, okay, that's where I'm from. Right. Did I have the body type of a Pueblo woman? No, not so much. I'm taller. No one can quite see. I'm a little bit taller. I'm curvier. I'm more Brazilian in that way. And certainly my hair and their different attributes. So when I went to Brazil, my body image chatter in my head would get very quiet because my body type matched that. Doesn't match the dominant U.S. culture type at all. And, doesn't match the Pueblo, but it does match, in Brazil. So there is a sense of kind of my nervous system recognizing, something similar and feeling like, okay, I can let down just a little bit, but it's never 100%.
That's part of what it means to have a multicultural background, I guess, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is what, is both the challenge and the skill, right? So the challenge is knowing in some ways that at least for me, I'm never going to fit in fully to the cultures from where I'm from, nor in the cultures that I live within, right? Because of that, I have a heightened sense of awareness and attunement to folks and to my environment. That can be overwhelming. It can erase my sense of self. I can get very blended, become a chameleon, which I did do, a lot in my life. Or with some, kind of coming back into myself and that process of getting to know who I am, as really all these parts are living within me. All these identities are living within me. How can I bring that to the forefront to be a skill where I can choose to attune to folks, where I can read more of the nuances and the subtleties of difference, where I don't feel, in a state of fight or flight when I come across something that feels like it's not receiving me in the way that I think I would like it to, whether that's a person or an environment. So it's really a shift between those two states of feeling at kind of the mercy of the code switching, which is my work, right? Embodied code switching, or having it be a proactive skill and being like, okay, this part of me can meet this cultural environment. Let me bring that forward as much as feels right for me so that I can be part of this. Yeah.
I want to know more about the embodied code switching. Before that, can you talk a little bit about what like somatic counseling, what body psychotherapy, like what these things are, how they differ from maybe more, understood typical formats of therapy and things like that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think it's, somatic counseling and body psychotherapy, when I went into the program, which was 2012, somewhat known. I'm not sure how well known it was. It's been around since the 90s, if not before then. So it's a field that's been growing and becoming much more, I think, mainstream, because in general, I think a lot of folks are becoming much more curious about the role of the body, the role of, contemplative practice, which is a factor in that also with somatic counseling, mindfulness, and, how to be with our bodies in a different way, right? So there has been that movement. You look at yoga and you look at, meditation retreats and really coming into ourselves, and even trauma, especially, trauma modalities, very much grounded in the body and our nervous systems. And even neuroscience, very much linked to what is happening within our bodies. The brain is part of the body, right? So somatic counseling, of course, it's still talk therapy. We're talking, but it's also, what are our bodies communicating? What do they hold within us in terms of our histories, our traumas, our pathways to healing? How do we bring that into a therapy session by being aware of those sensations, those movements, those patterns of movement that can offer themselves up in the course of a therapeutic session for deepening into insight or processing, emotions and situations. So, it's not a situation, and I've told clients this in the past when they've come to me and they said, "Are you going to be watching me, assessing my body?" I'm like, no, that's not what.
Not physical therapy.
No, not physical therapy. It's not about that. But, as we're talking, our bodies are also talking. And so for me, my role as a somatic therapist is to, of course, notice the words and move along with the words, but also notice what's happening below the words, deeper than the words, right? So if I have a client start talking about a particular situation and their hand does something 2 or 3 times, right? Even if it's subtle, I notice that. I'm like, okay, there's something moving here, right? A lot of times we'll make that conscious in terms of a process. It's like, what would it be like if we're talking about taking up space, right? If we physically took up space right now, how would that feel in your seat? How far can you go? Can you stretch a little bit and just stay with that movement? What does that movement want to tell you about taking up space? So we bring the body in as a partner in the process. Yeah. And a lot of times it's amazing what will come through.
It sounds very, very dynamic in terms of, you don't start a session knowing where it's going to go necessarily. What comes out is very much an interplay between you guys that are working.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, for me, this type of therapy is very client-centered, and can be very symbolic, and for some folks can be very spiritual and intergenerational. There's a lot about, again, what we hold in our bodies. That's not just ours, and this is, supported by science with epigenetics. And, we have legacies that are in our bodies, and oftentimes traumas in our bodies that we may have the opportunity to heal now that our ancestors couldn't. And it manifests, so there's also that invitation that I think, I hold, and a lot of my clients are actually exploring and have explored in terms of, yes, this does feel like my trauma, but it feels bigger than that too. And how can I interrupt that? Right. So it can be a very deep and broad experience to go where the body takes us.
When you combine that with like multiculturalism, I imagine sometimes you might run into like shame or embarrassment or the feeling of, I do feel this, but who am I to feel this? Who am I to own this experience that may not feel like mine, when you're split in so many directions.
Yeah. And especially if your identities are in conflict with one another. For instance, if you have one identity that's from a marginalized community and then you have another identity that's from a dominant culture, it's that conflict can be very hard to hold. And, much like what we do in relationship, with one another, those identities also need to form a relationship with each other, right? So within us. So how do we facilitate that? Because oftentimes there is no connection, especially if the fragmentation or the compartmentalization is so deep. There's a sense of like, I'm not going to touch into that side of me. I'm not going to go to this one because it's bad or it's good, get into those polarities. so what happens when we actually bring them to sit at the same table with each other? What do they want the other identity to know? What are the lessons that they've learned? What are the skills they have? But also, what are the wounds that they still hold that are coming up for healing now in a safer environment?
Is there anything that you would be comfortable sharing for yourself or with, somebody that you've worked with where we can bring it into the real a little bit more of what that looks like to bring those parts together, to have them talk?
Yeah. I mean, I use myself a lot in the book for that reason. Client stories are their own stories, right? So I want to respect that. I think for me, it's a little bit more subtle because both of my identities are marginalized in their own way, right? So being Native American in the United States is a particular identity. Being the daughter of an immigrant in the United States is also a particular identity. So each of them had specific kind of signatures for me. And I realized that the predominant marginalized identity for me was, for a long time, being Native American, mostly in my professional life early on. And kind of the pain that came with that was, again, sort of the not enoughness, and that I didn't know the language, hadn't been learning the language, and really, in some senses, didn't feel like my body fit the identity. So there was a constant reminder for me that I didn't quite fit there. So there was, for me, somatically, it was almost like I was trying to shrink myself into that identity. Right? So it was very protective for me. And there was a longing and a sadness around that. It's like, wanted to be part of. And my brother did make the choice to go fully back into the Pueblo and has been part of the community since he was 18, if not sooner than that, learned the language. I'm very grateful to him because he's brought it back to our family in a way that's passed down to our kids now, which is beautiful. And kind of making my way out of the comparison piece with him, all the shoulds, took many years. And I'm not quite out of it, but still working with that. And he and I have really wonderful conversations about what does it mean to be Native, in different ways. So, that identity had a lot to do with what was happening in my day-to-day life here in the United States. Because the Brazilian identity didn't really pop up as often, and it hasn't in the last few years because I haven't gone back and forth quite as much, that also had a sense of longing, but a little bit different. Almost like I felt like I kept starting to immerse and to really get to know that part of myself, and then I would leave and come back. So in a way, I share that kind of experience with third culture kids who also have that sense, like just as you're getting someplace, then you're moved again, right? So that sense of longing, because I had the body type that felt like I belonged there, felt like it was incomplete, right? So it's not enoughness, but in a different way.
Right.
So those two, as they started to talk to each other, there was a lot about following rules for me. It felt like I had to follow rules that someone else had set. And so really that became kind of the central work for me, is like, whose rules are they, right? And how can I choose how to immerse myself in each of these cultures now as an adult, and really do some of the inner child work to take those younger selves along with me into the environments and be their literal translator now in a way that I didn't have back then. So it's complex what I'm saying, but like there's a lot of, first of all, awareness in terms of who the identities are that live within us. How are they held in our bodies? How do we literally move when we're in them? Spending time with that, and then noticing, what is it that I am getting from my environments, from my family, from those cultures, as both my child self interpreted them, but also as my adult self now, really looking at it in a different way.
For you, in, Pueblo culture, in, Brazilian culture, has the way you feel that in your body changed as you've grown and developed? Do you feel it differently now?
Yeah.
How so?
That's a really good question. I was just thinking about that this morning too. I would say even like 10 years ago, it still felt very different for me. Going back to the Pueblo, I would feel my body shift. Like I was saying, it would get a little bit
Shrinking.
like shrunker. I was trying to get shorter and not as curvy. You know? And also, just things for me and my system would get quieter around that, and you can tell on video, people can tell I use my hands a lot. That's the Brazilian side, I think, so I keep that kind of as my own markers myself, no matter what identity, but I tend to be a little bit more, take up more space than what that environment I had felt would do. Now it's like, because I have like deeper relationships with my brother, with the community, through my kids also who are involved now, it's different. I'm not just myself as a young person coming with my parents and my grandmother, not understanding things that are happening. I still don't understand many of the things, but that's okay, because I understand the people I'm with. And I know that they are connected to me and that they care for me. So there's a sense of safety now and that, and acceptance that I didn't quite feel when I was younger. So for me, it feels like I've got a little bit more room to move with that. I'm still very aware of what the movements are, because I want to be part of the community in that way. But I'm not like pushing parts of myself away anymore. Right. So that to me is a deeply somatic experience. Brazil, I'm actually going to be going back in June. For me, I have
last time you've been prior to that?
A couple years ago.
Okay.
And so for me, the language, I have the language. I did learn the language. I'm not completely fluent, but I dream in it. I understand it. It's, I can read it. So for me, that part's a little bit dormant. And so I am curious to see what that's going to feel like when I go back, in June, and start kind of waking that up. But I do know that when I'm there, there's just so much about the sensory world that surrounds me when I'm in Brazil that I just, it lights me up. I really like that. It's a different way of being, and I love touching into that.
Do you walk differently? Like, do you feel yourself walk differently?
Totally. Yeah. In all those contexts, I did. And that was part of the discovery process. Again, when I was there's a particular class at Naropa called Body Movement, Observation, and Assessment. So that's one of the classes we do. And we were asked to, describe and to embody our movement signatures, what we call movement signatures. And that's when I discovered the 3 that I had, right? And so for Brazil, it was much more like flowy, bigger, there's, much more touch involved with Brazilian culture. It's the personal distance is smaller. So it's just more, tangible in some ways. And that's not to say that Pueblo culture isn't that, but it's different Pueblo culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The quality of touch is different, eye contact different, all that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for, being willing to bring it to yourself and, share your personal examples. That's really valuable to make it, a little bit more tangible.
Yeah.
So I have an idea of what code switching is in general. What the term that you have coined, I think, yourself, it's embodied code switching. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Talk about that a bit.
Yeah. So when I did research, because in our program, somatic counseling program, we had master's papers to write. So not quite theses. They were like meant to be, submitted for publication. I had heard the term code switching, around the time that I was discovering these different movement signatures of mine. And I thought, okay, this is super fascinating. Let me start doing some research about this. And code switching as a term really started with linguistics. So, speaking to people who are bilingual, multilingual, and curious about how do people know when to switch between their languages, often sometimes in the middle of a sentence, right? So a lot about external cues and how we know how to do that. And then the next kind of field to pick that up was biracial and multiracial psychology. And that got very interested in what they call, cognitive frame switching or frame switching within, psychological means. So starting to study what happens with folks that have different racial identities, and I would say cultural identities, as a broader context, in the brain, also within behaviors, right? So, we could go down that road. It's fascinating, the research on what happens in the brain if you have, even just symbolic cues to switch. It doesn't have to be words. And someone who's bicultural, they will switch their worldviews according to their cultural identities, according to what those cues are bringing forward. So that was that other piece of research that I'm like, okay, this is super interesting. It also identified that being multiracial, biracial, psychologically can have both, wonderful skills and really difficult situations. So we've named some of them, which is compartmentalization, fragmentation. But you also can have things like higher sense of social attunement, social flexibility, a higher level of awareness for, intolerance for difference, those kind of things, right? So then that whole field starts talking about how do these things, work together if you want the identities to start, really being more congruent. Okay. So then I'm like, okay, great. This is wonderful. Someone must have talked about this in the body. Because I'm like, I know I feel it in the body. I know my movements change. My sense of personal distance changes. My posture changes. All that. That's got to exist out there. This was 2015. I was doing the research. At that time, I couldn't find any discussion about code switching from a somatic perspective and somatic research at all. So I started to kind of piece it together myself. And so I started with really the concept of what does it mean to be culturally embodied? Just even defining that. And at that time, I spoke about it in terms of nonverbal communication together with somatic awareness, right? Which are not quite the same things, but they're complementary. And then I wanted to capture the movement of it because we move between. That's what code switching is we're moving in between these different identities. And there is also an in-between space in those identities. So embodied code switching actually takes each of these identities within their culturally embodied ways and invites, a person to move in between them consciously and with awareness and noticing what happens as they go from one to the other and if they're in between. And touching into, and I have a loop called the SIA loop, sensation, interpretation, and action. So what am I sensing in my body? What do I feel? Interpretation, what meaning am I making from this? What are my thoughts and emotions? And then action, what do I do or not want to do, right? So as those three kind of inform you in those identities as you move, it really starts to shed some light in terms of like, oh, this is how I actually start to do the switch within myself. And you begin to get more conscious and proactive about it. So the loop is an infinity loop. So that's why I'm doing that with my deers. So that's the movement of it. Since then, in the book now, I've expanded cultural embodiment to add another layer of what I call awareness, 3 types of awareness, which is social awareness, emotional awareness, and environmental awareness. And those felt really important because all of those are culturally bound. How we relate to each other socially is culturally bound. It depends on our cultures, on how we feel belonging and empathy, how we attune. I talk about mirror neurons and interpersonal synchrony there. How do we feel like we belong in a group? How do we share movements to come together? Emotional awareness, there's research out now and has been for a while now that really confirms that emotions are not universal. They are also culturally bound. How we express them, how we feel them, where we feel them in the body, depends on our cultures. And then environmental, for me, it's about space and place, which I feel is so powerful and we overlook a lot of times is our spaces and places actually speak to us in terms of prompting us to be in our identities. And it's not just race, gender, sexual orientation. It's also roles. Like if you're in an office, folks know once you walk into your office, it's cueing you on how to be in the office, how you move, how you dress, how you speak, that your environment has now let you know that you're in a different space and place with its own set of rules and norms.
There's, I guess, like an intersectionality to this stuff too, right? Like, as you were saying that, yes, like I go into the office a few days a week. My presentation there is different. I'm also a queer man. I'm in a, hetero-presenting relationship, but I exist within queer spaces too. So like, if I have a patient that is, overtly queer, then there's another layer to that, right? Of I'm in the office and I'm working with somebody, within this subset. So all these things, it's like, there's a lot of layers there, it seems.
Yeah. And I mean, and isn't that wonderful what you just said too? Because now you know the layers, right? So within the office space, in some ways you can kind of do your own kind of embodied code switching to move that identity a little bit more in the background. And perhaps if you're meeting, a queer client with queer identity, there's a commonality of experience that's a felt sense one, not necessarily lived experience one, but felt sense one that can come into the foreground a bit more in service of what's happening in that room. Right.
Yeah. And I could see that in like posture and yeah, you said talking, hand talking, the different nonverbals you talked about. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so powerful. I think when we start to realize that we have that ability, and it's an ability to connect with one another, and really having diversity is the most important part of developing empathy, right? It is across difference that we develop empathy. Oftentimes, if we don't have that, if we have these same experiences, the group that we're in, we can share that experience, but we actually don't get to touch the edge of it enough to appreciate it, right? And that's where like the discussion of power, oppression, and privilege can come in, is that privilege, in a way, dulls the experience, I think, of building relationship, because you already assume that somebody holds all the same qualities and values and experiences that you do. And that actually, I think robs us of the chance of learning about one another and really meeting each other in an authentic way. So, being multicultural, and I want to broaden that term to include, all of the different categories that can be intersections for us, right? Because they all have their own, like I said, set of norms, nonverbals, experiences, sense of belonging, all of that. All of that is important to hold because it helps us become much more flexible with one another and with ourselves.
One of the things I noticed when you were first talking about your early experiences in recognizing your embodiment and the somatic experience of being in these different settings without language to access reminded me a lot of what I hear from, neurodiverse people, maybe people who have autism or something like that. So I feel like there's a lot of value there for people who might be in those situations too with this kind of work.
Oh, yeah. It's so interesting that you say that too, because I just did a book signing, my first one, which is lovely, a couple 3-4 days ago, yay, at Naropa. And I had a couple students. One of them was a former student who identifies as neurodivergent. They're about ready to graduate and have their private practice. And there's another cohort member of mine that is neurodivergent, has been doing also their work therapeutically, somatic therapy in this way. It's a very different set of rules and norms, and so exciting to dive into. And I hope to continue that conversation with them. And it's, for me, a way of not pathologizing folks. If you can understand the somatic piece of it, then it's just another language, right? So I think we get hung up a lot on the words and the intellectual knowledge and the frameworks and the this and the that we want to get into as therapists or even as educators, because I teach as well, that we miss, what are the lived experiences of the folks that we're working with? How can they illuminate, what I'm teaching or what I'm bringing into a therapy session with their own felt sense of it? And oftentimes it's that insight that leads to an aha moment or a healing moment or a learning moment that I could not have, created even if I knew what was coming up. Yeah. It is such an amazing spark, I think.
This is certainly not my area of specialty, but I do always say people are the experts on themselves, and that only is deeper with what you're talking about, right? It's not just like N of one. It's like, where in that N of one are we talking about? Literally only that person could come to know that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll give you an example of one of the fun things I remember from a client. Mm-hmm. We were working with an inner critic, and everyone has one, or inner perfectionist, either one, this time with an inner critic, I'm over that. No. I still, my inner critic comes up, lovely protector that she is. Mm-hmm. But so my client had an inner critic come up. And so we went into it somatically. So asked where it lived in their body. And then what images or words would come up around that? What did this piece want to tell them? And, and as the body and as movement and as sensation continued to just really lead us through this session, this inner critic manifested itself as, first of all, it kind of came out of my client. We externalized it. It was a snake in a bucket, literally. So that's what they were seeing. My client was seeing this. And just so curious about the snake in the bucket, watched it move. Of course, it's all visualization, but we're both in this together. So, I'm asking questions, they're asking questions of this. And really the agreement then that happened between them was, I value you, inner critic. I understand what you're doing. And I'm going to put the bucket over here, while I want to do this over here. Right. So again, this is it's highly symbolic, what the body does, and movement being part of that is so essential too, because it's, we are constantly moving, even if we feel like we're still, we're not, our hearts are beating, we have breath, our eyelashes are going, our eyelids are, all that kind of stuff.
Constantly fighting gravity, pushing us toward the earth, yeah.
And if we allow ourselves to move with what's coming up, it will lead us to the next thing, right? Our answers are ever evolving. So I love that example of the snake in the bucket because, it was tangible and relatable and completely unexpected, right? And healing in that moment. And I didn't create it, it was co-created in the space, but it was fully my client's beautiful work in doing that.
Right. And it's so cool to think of if you could see the scene from the outside and see what everybody was seeing, right? You see this thing get pulled out into the room and you're both interacting with it. And I guess that's what I meant by dynamic, earlier, very, very much dynamic as compared to something that is a little bit more nuts and bolts.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's so much more literal space to move with work like this. And I think that's also something that we tend to, forget when we're in a learning mode or a therapeutic mode is it seems to get very still for some folks, that sit in the chair, all these conditioned ways of interacting with this kind of experience, when in fact it can be very fluid, and very unexpected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, your work, you said you kind of had two careers, right? Your earlier work, was that more focused on advocacy and social justice?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I started out, like I said, studying international relations, and did my first master's in international relations. So I was in DC, and that led me to international education, educational exchange with professionals, which was so much fun. And eventually it led me through some other serendipitous events to working in the Department of Commerce as the Native American Affairs Policy Advisor.
Whoa.
I know, for the Clinton administration,
Yeah.
And into the Bush administration a bit. That position, each federal agency, because of the government-to-government relationship with tribes, should be required to have, a point of contact. At that time, the Clinton administration was very proactive in that, so all the agencies had their version of what I was doing. So we have points of contact. And so I worked with, many tribes, in relation to the programs that we had at Department of Commerce, but I also worked with interagency groups as well. And it was just a wonderful time. I felt so proactive in what was happening in Indian country, what was happening in government. It's not an easy road, but I have to tell you, working in government was probably one of the best experiences I've had, because the people I've met, the career folks that were there, are good-hearted people, amazing, dedicated folks. And, government is it's slow moving. Well, it used to be some.
We are recording this in 2025.
I know. Oh, it's this is the part that pains me to see what's happening, because these are the unsung heroes, honestly. So many folks that work in federal government, the work that they do, it's, they could go anywhere else. I could have gone anywhere else, but working for government like that, I think taps into what you asked me earlier about how I felt as a kid, what I wanted to do in the world. I wanted to help. I wanted to be of service. That's where I was doing it, right? So making sure people knew about programs and funding, making sure we could support where we could, seeing all these amazing projects that folks were doing. I was very much involved in what was called bridging the digital divide back then. That was also part of my work. I actually turned into a nonprofit after I left government, was trying to get telecommunications to tribes. So, there's a lot of good that comes from that. And I did a lot of organizing around trying to get legislation passed and that kind of thing. So that was an amazing first career. And then I had my kids. I'd left government, had my nonprofit. By the time my second one came along, I was like, you know what? Being in advocacy and being a mother were two very different energy signatures for me. So I'm like, right now I want to focus on my kids, and I was very lucky to be able to do that. I'm really happy I got to do that. And I was able to continue to move to Boulder. And then I realized at a certain point, my kids are going to be gone. They're going to leave the house, and I would like to have something of mine there, and that's why I decided to go back to school. And Naropa, being in Boulder, is such a unique university. For folks who don't know, it's contemplative based. There are 5 different counseling programs. So contemplative, which is Buddhist informed, transpersonal, somatic, art therapy, and wilderness therapy. And I loved the somatic program. It just was something so completely different, and yet made so much sense to me in my experience. And so now, like with this book, which is kind of completely unanticipated, all of these careers have converged into what is in my book now. Those experiences that, all of sort of the unconscious ways that I was dealing with vicarious trauma, with, my identities, with, cultural difference. It is fascinating for me to see that there was a through line in many different careers that I held over time that have now informed what I hope is a really good guide and resource for folks now that also feels personal.
That's so interesting. So you went from, very macro to very micro, right? On the individual body scale. Now you're kind of, integrating, much in the ways that we were talking about, you integrating other parts too.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, so we're at a very weird time in, the country and in the United States, right? There are people that are being, forcefully deported for, false reasons or whatever reason. We are seeing kind of the near criminalization of things like DEI and, the expectation that we are doing patriotic education and things like that. Where does the work that you've done up to now come into play with people who are experiencing the fear or burden of those things?
Thank you for bringing this up.
I'm glad you reacted that way. I know that's a big question.
Thank you. No, I'm looking over to the side because I'm looking at my book, and just, I have such love for this book and such, how can I put this? I felt more than called to do this book. This book is really, my ancestors wanted me to do this. I'm going to start crying. It was that strong of a message. I didn't quite understand what was going to happen with it. My own personal process, like I said, got divorced in 2021. This book literally landed on me. My editor found me because I did an online workshop, and she's in Scotland. And so I get a message from her. It's a month after my separation, asking if I'd be interested in talking about doing a book. So there's something about when things come to us in our lives, that if we're paying attention and we're open and we heed the call, it leads us to where we need to go. So I was writing this book all the way through. It was finished last January. So as it was going through all the proofings, and it takes a while to go through all the proofreadings, we're coming up against this election. And so for me, I was like, okay, if this is going to come out in March, what world is this book coming into? Right. And so, on one side of it, I thought, okay, there would be more reception, let's say, with Kamala coming and more understanding because of her multicultural identity. And when Trump got elected, at first I was honestly concerned and scared for the book to come out during this time.
Sure.
And then my whole history of being an advocate and an activist just woke up and realized this book is my form of protest. Mm-hmm. And it is coming at a time when I need it, when I want the information out there in terms of what we can do ourselves to value ourselves, to hone our own skills that come from these identities. And I mean, completely and totally in terms of let me support you wherever you are with this book as if I were sitting next to you. That's what the intent of this book is. Mm. And so I'm very lucky because the publisher is international. So this book, and also because of Amazon, is available all over the world. They work with educational institutions and training programs. It's not a trade book. It's a professional title, which at first I was like, okay, but that makes sense to me now because it is hopefully going to go to folks that want to learn about what identities mean in terms of our embodiment of them and also what our strengths and superpowers can be when we hold them. This is also not new news to folks who hold multiple cultural identities, okay? This is the thing that I really want to say out loud. Just because the words are banned, just because the news says we don't exist, just because these things are happening doesn't mean that we don't exist or that we are not of value. In a lot of ways, it's almost too late what is trying to be erased. We're already here.
Always have been.
Always have been. My ancestors survived. They gave me the gifts of survival that will get me through this time. My kids and this generation, they are so savvy and so smart and so in touch with their own healing in a way that they had to be, early on, that they're still in the midst of all these changes, but they will be the ones that hold the newness of what we're going towards, right? I don't want to leave, it's not their responsibility. And, my generation didn't do so great either in preparing where we are now. But this is, as we've all, I think, as a human race have come into a process of getting curious about our own healing, getting curious about who we are. How do I understand myself? How do I do better in relationships? How do I take care of myself better? How do I find strength? How do I find resourcing? Even naming trauma, like that wasn't even part of the discussion before COVID, So all these things are like bubbling up to consciousness in our society. My book, I want it to meet that and then be there so that folks know, like, at least one person in the world sees them, values them, and knows that what they hold is what we need as a human race. We need this, We need to be able to be attuned to each other, to appreciate differences, to value diversity, because without diversity, both in humans and in our ecology, we don't survive. We just don't, right? So this is why in the book, I talk about identity, I talk about culture, I talk about trauma, I talk about power, I talk about institutional oppression and ideological and interpersonal and internalized oppression. I talk about the gifts and the legacies and the healing of intergenerational trauma in a 360-degree view. It's our healing now not only heals our future generations, it heals our past ones too. I really believe that. And so we need this right now. And we need folks to take ownership of their own experience and their own healing and then share that with others.
I'm really grateful for it. It's very brave, I think, to be willing to put that out. It's kind of a F you to all the things you're trying to be, that you are being gaslit into, thinking that they don't exist in the first place or that they're silly. So, right. The world does need it and needs people like you to be, doing that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Where
Going there with
did the art for the book come from? It's beautiful.
So isn't it gorgeous? So the cover art, I never got to meet the designer for that. That's from the publisher.
Okay.
But the art on the inside, I do want to shout out to the illustrator, Marcia Pimas. She and I were connected through the publisher as well. But once we started talking, this is serendipity again. She lives in Germany. She was born in Russia, adopted by Spanish parents, so she is multicultural. And as we started to talk about what, I was hoping for the images, and it was just this beautiful conversation. I love her dearly. She has made beautiful images from complex ideas, which I think in the book, for me, I'm a visual learner. I want to see pictures, I also want to see flow in the book. And for me, that's why it was important for there to be images, for there to be different fonts and different ways of kind of interacting with the surface of the book. But she just did a beautiful, beautiful job. And especially, I know this sounds funny, but like in the trauma section, trying to capture what trauma feels like in the body with fight or flight, freeze or fawn, she nailed it. Like just for that, just go and look at those images. And it's like, yeah, I can feel it in my body. It's just a beautiful piece of work all the way through. So I love her work.
That's awesome. And in your work. So I would love for you to take the opportunity to just, talk a bit more about the book. So remind us what it's called, how it's kind of structured, like what will people be expecting to get if they actually decide to pick it up?
Yes, please pick it up. So it's called Movement and Identity, Multiculturalism, Somatic Awareness, and Embodied Code Switching. It's a mouthful, I know, but we wanted people to understand what it was about. And the book itself is structured, and this is so much fun when I was writing it. You can come into it any place you want, honestly. For me, I'm one of those people in some ways that I like to open up a book to a passage, and that to me feels like what I'm supposed to get for the day. This book in some ways can be like that. It's organized really on the front and back ends with skills and tools. So you can read about them in the front, start practicing them. That you get invitations all the way through the book to do that. At the end, you also get reintroduced to the tools and the skills. And I put down what you've actually been practicing and why that's what's been, developed. So you get to see what to do, but also why is it important, and that you've already, what you've learned as you've been doing it. Then there's also personal writing. Before each section, I've got either a poem or an essay of mine. So I share that kind of storytelling piece in a different way. So again, for me, I really love to hear someone's voice, not just the research. So, folks will be able to read some of the poetry and read some kind of introspective pieces that I've written about identity and moving in between cultures and the body and trauma and power. So those are there. Like I said before, the main sections are about identity, multicultural identity, culture, multiculturalism, the shaping forces of identity, which I talk about power, oppression, privilege, and trauma. Intergenerational trauma is there. And then the last section is really about coming home to ourselves. And that's where we talk about code switching, embodied code switching, and cultural embodiment in the sense that really learning who I am. And there's so many opportunities for introspection. There's a ton of exercises. Each section kind of has its own recap, which is based on the skills of embodied code switching. So you get to practice all the way through. And really, it's an invitation. There's also thought bubbles, which I also love in there. So it's you'll be reading, you'll see a little thought bubble.
Like a pop-up video.
Kind of like a little pop-up video, but in print form. But it's that's where I wanted my voice as a therapist or a teacher to come in too. And oftentimes, especially in the trauma section, or all the sections can be really tender. You'll in a way hear me say through those bubbles, it's take a beat. It's okay to breathe, or this can be the big thing right now. You have permission to do those kind of things. So it's really, I want it to be as relational as it possibly can be.
Very huge.
As well as being a huge resource. So I'm a total geek with information and learning. So you'll have that there too.
It sounds really well balanced in that way. It's very mindful of you to include, the hard information, practical tips that people can, and tools that people can use, and the human element of, here's me, so you know who you're talking to in this, exchange, and here's a little bit of me peeking through to remind you about your humanity as you're going through it.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear, I'm excited for you to hear what particularly stands out to people, what exercises or what things that pop up that really mean something to the people that are reading it. It just came out, right?
It just came out in March. Yeah, March 21st. So it's brand new in the world. And it's so much fun to see who's buying it. So, I have my relatives in Brazil, have found it on Amazon. Lovely. I have friends in Europe that are starting to buy it. My kids and their friends are so supportive. It's that's really amazing. And I love that generation to really dive into this, because they're living it, we're all living it. And so in a way it's I guess I do want to say this really overtly too, is these, what can feel like wounds, challenges, shame pieces, parts that aren't, held or whatever, they also are incredibly, valuable and loving and strong and have so much to teach us and teach each other. It is through our vulnerability that we can be strong, that we often are that's where we find our strength. And if you're an advocate out there and you feel helpless in the world right now, it is enough to do your own work, to find those places within yourself that need bridging, that need healing, doing that work, and then being in relationship with someone else where that healing can get extended. One person at a time is as powerful as a million person march. It really is. Because you don't know what that next life is going to touch in terms of the next life after that and the life that they encounter of all the people that they come across in the world. So being a therapist, being a teacher, all those things, it may not feel like it's big, but it is big.
Beautifully said. Before we start to wrap things up, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you were hoping to get a chance to talk about? Is there anything else that you do want to, make sure that you say before we wrap up?
I think what I would just say is we've lost the ability to wonder and to stay curious. Our phones have kind of taken that away from us, If there's anything that folks get from today, no matter what your beliefs are, political, spiritual, anything like that, and I welcome all of that, really, become curious. Notice what you notice in the world and in other people, but more importantly, notice what you don't notice. Get curious about what you don't know, not just about people, but what might be a deeper level of understanding behind what you read, what you see, what you assume, right? You don't have to change any of that, but start to get curious and then start to really play with awareness, because we are so culturally bound by what we even notice that we may be missing a huge opportunity that's right in front of us for learning.
That's a wonderful place to leave that. So thank you for adding that in. Before I let you go, can you tell people where they can find you? Where do you want to direct people toward?
Yes. So please come visit me at my website. It's my full name. So marciabonatowarren.com. That's where I'm going to keep updates on things happening. You can also follow me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Is where I'm in social media and, trying to navigate that world too, since I go in and out of it. So that's a different set of cultural norms that has some challenges. So I'll do my best on that one, but definitely, come to the website. I'm trying to build that as a home of different resources and activities and things that are going on. So, and the book can be found through Singing Dragon Publishers directly, as well as online booksellers. And I love, supporting local bookstores. So if folks want to encourage that to happen in your local bookstore, please feel free to do that too.
Is it in any brick and mortar stores right now that you know of?
It's at Boulder Bookstore, so it's in my local bookstore. I'm not sure where else it is, so I would love to hear from readers if anyone wants to let me know where it's out there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'd be thrilled.
Awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I really appreciate our conversation. It's been really good, really, really good.